reason why stories of why are important is that's how you begin to build trust, regardless of when you make it about an outcome alone, it can be very hard. And one thing that I've always said, and it relates to what you were saying about early on when people are like, oh, great, you've done all these great things and believe in the hype. I've always remembered what it was like at the start of high school to be that kid who couldn't kick a ball, whose self-esteem was so low that I also had bad grades. I was bottom of the class. And I remembered the difference one teacher made in my life who said, you may not see it in you, but I see potential. I'm willing to work with you. And I remember the difference that made in me. So when people started saying, oh, wow, you did all these wonderful things, I was like, oh, no, I still remember what it was like to be that kid who people said was a loser, wasn't going to amount to much, wasn't going to achieve much, and the difference that teacher made in my life. So often I tell that story as why, because we all need, not necessarily a teacher in the classroom, but those people around us. And sometimes that could even be in terms of the basics, like access to healthcare, access to a midwife if you're giving birth in a country where, 1 in 8 children still die below the age of 5 or including in childbirth.
Imagine a college student with dreams of changing the world. Now, fast forward 12 years and picture that same individual having mobilized over $43 billion and positively impacting the lives of over 1.3 billion people. It's like the size of India. Well, that student is none other than Michael Sheldrick, our guest today on How We Change the World. Michael co-founded Global Citizen while he was still in university, and then he turned his vision into a powerful movement. It's actually a movement that inspires millions of people to take action against extreme poverty and other pressing global issues. Now, as Chief Policy and Affairs Officer, he has guided Global Citizen to amass a following of well over 10 million engaged supporters. And in our conversation today, Michael goes into his role as a policy entrepreneur, which is a term that he uses to describe his innovative approach to driving meaningful policy changes. So in this conversation, he's going to share stories from his journey, the challenges that he's faced along the way, and all the successes that he's achieved, or at least some of them. But all of these are chronicled in his new book, which we talk about in great detail. This book is truly a game changer for anyone working to make the world better. From working with world leaders and celebrities like Beyonce, the president of the World Bank, to hosting the annual Global Citizen Festival in Central Park in New York City, Michael's story is truly a testament to what can be achieved with passion, dedication, and, most importantly, perhaps, strategic action. For those eager to stay updated on his work, I highly recommend checking out his Substack newsletter at michaelsheldrick.com. But for now, get ready to be inspired as we dive into this remarkable journey of Michael Sheldrick on How We Change the World. Hello, Michael Sheldrick, and welcome to How We Change the World.
Thanks for having me, Deborah. Really great to be on your show and chatting to you today.
Well, I personally couldn't be happier, as I'm just sharing with you. I feel like you're sort of the archetype for this podcast. You're you are sort of the essence of what this embodies. So, the work that you do. And so I know that listeners will be so interested in really everything you have to say. So let's just jump right in. You're a self-described policy entrepreneur, which is a term. We're going to explain all these things, but it's a term I want you to go into. Well, it's really what the whole book's about. So I know we will go into it in some depth. But to be very specific, you're the Chief Policy and Government Affairs Officer at Global Citizen, which a lot of people know about, millions of people know about, but there's probably some billions that still don't. So you were the co-founder and the driving force really behind it since you were in university, which is about, 12 years ago you founded this organization, 2012?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to have you talk about, of course, organization in depth as well. But the occasion for our conversation today, it really is the release of this book, which I've been gushing about, and I'm going to hold it up. Kind of lame sometimes to hold it up,
there
but I'm going to anyway. Yeah, from ideas to impact. I can't read backwards, but Playbook for influencing and implementing change in a divided world. And that in a divided world, which is actually, I see now that it's in red, is the key. Because
Exactly.
if we weren't in a divided world, we'd be able to solve everything.
Well, it would be a lot easier, right? It would be a lot easier because we would agree on everything, right? By its nature, I think when you're divided, a big part of it is how do you bring people on board? Because, I mean, you mentioned I'm a policy entrepreneur, and I define a policy entrepreneur as really someone who is able to navigate gridlock, drive meaningful policy change that has a real material impact on people's lives. And they often do so in a very unconventional way, right? Like they break the status quo and use unconventional methods. But one of the key ingredients for success that literally every policy entrepreneur I interviewed for the book, whether it was those working to address period poverty, whether it was those working to address how do you transition a coal community to renewable energy without leaving workers behind and stranded without a job, through leaders of marginalized communities, right? One of the key ingredients of success, they always said, was, you have to deal with those you don't always agree with 100% of the time, right? Which sounds very obvious, but it's easier said than done. And of course, in a divided world, that makes it so much harder because everyone says there's this tension coming from often your own tribe, your own side, where people say, listen, I'm worried about being called out. I'm worried about being called a traitor. I'm worried about being accused of betrayal if I engage with an idea, an organization, or a group that doesn't 100% mesh with what my tribe believes is the ideal outcome, right? Or the ideal vision. And so, look, there's many things that go into creating change, but I think, how we resolve that gridlock is really the key requirement making change in today's world. The good news is at the community level, at the state level, at the national level, and even the global level, there's these great stories of navigating gridlock where people are making change, right? And they're proven that the best antidote to apathy and indifference is action. And a core tenet of my belief is having a bias for action, and that there's always something we can do, and to focus on that one thing we can do to propel us forward.
Well, what you were describing sounds like, first of all, you're talking, I know you're Australian, but you live in the US now. And you're just, and maybe, and this is in many parliaments and legislatures around the world, that there's this division, but obviously in the United States, it's absolute gridlock. But I think when people think of division, that's more what they're thinking of is politically. But the truth is, we're, like you mentioned, people who just want to go out and make a change, everyone's in gridlock. And I feel like that's the difference. It just, and do you think this is in, do you think what's given rise to this division is the fear of the of like climate change and these huge things that we're facing that, maybe that's creating more division?
I mean, it's interesting because the world has certainly faced challenges before, right? You look at, the Second World War, you look at other conflicts, you look at the Cold War, and our world has been divided, if not at a community level. And I think maybe the difference here, unlike the Cold War, you look at the 70s and 80s, whereas division globally, when there's a conflict or a division globally, tends to drive people together at a national and a community level. I think what you're seeing is that polarization that says prevents gridlock at the UN on climate change. Creates gridlock at the UN on climate change. You see that same gridlock and polarization, not just at a national level in legislators or parliaments or in the US Congress. You see it in institutions and organizations.
Right.
You see it in nonprofits. Like I was with a group of nonprofit leaders last week, And there was one woman there, senior leader, and she was bemoaning the fact by saying, since when did it become so perilous to help a child in need? And she was like, I'm helping this one child. This is one nonprofit. No one's ever said one nonprofit should go out there and solve all the world's challenges. And she said, I'm being called out because they're saying, well, you're helping this child over here, but what about this child here? What about this child here, right?
Right. That's the kind of thing you do hear a lot.
Exactly. And similarly, I have friends who are heads of corporate philanthropy programs, and in philanthropy as well, is you're seeing this where it's almost pitching, and the danger with this is it's almost pitching vulnerable groups, people who need assistance against one another. And where this comes from, there's a bunch of reasons, and I certainly don't blame social media or technology for the world's ills, because I think, those, you see headlines where it's like social media has led to division, polarization. And I'm like, well, listen, I don't think you can blame it's a tool. And I don't think you can blame social media alone for political violence or division or even civil war. But I think what it has created is a distraction. And what I mean by that is, when people are feeling a sense of powerlessness and a sense of desire to do something, right, they look for something that they can do. And I think what social media allows us to do is to find an alternative platform, right, to make it feel like we're making a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And in the categories that make up happiness, and this is the prop I spoke about, this is dopamine, right? In the categories that make up happiness, the chemical of dopamine, it gives us that short-term hit, right?
Makes us feel like we did something. Yeah.
Yeah, that short-term dopamine high.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And in some cases it might be posting. In some cases it might be saying we're standing in solidarity with this group or another. In other cases it might also resort to policing what other people are saying and being like, oh, you didn't say this on Instagram, or you said this, right? And it's a distraction in the sense it gives us that short-term high, but really, and it might make us feel righteous, certain, and safe, but really we're not having necessarily a material impact on people's lives, right? But the flip side of it, I also believe social media as a tool, and you said this, if you use it in the right way to actually channel people to action, then it can work. It can make a difference. But we have to be guided by the question of impact, and are we really making a material impact in people's lives? And that's what should be our true north.
Yeah, I've had this thought for many years now, and I think people are getting somewhat educated on more issues because of social media. And there's so many conversations around, and I've thought this for years. I've noticed it's like, because people have learned something about an issue and discussed it and argued about it or something, they do also have the feeling that they've done something.
Exactly.
And I have just felt that for so long. Well, just so people understand what kinds of things you've been involved in. Let's go back to Global Citizen, first of all. It's an organization, as you said, you started when you were in university, and I guess with a couple of your friends that are now in the organization as well, co-founders. Yeah. I have their names on here, and I know I don't have right in front of, Hugh Evans and Simon Moss. So what, I know you believe in the power of story. You talk about that a lot in the book, and especially the how and the why. So what, can you use that a little bit to tell us about your story, how you started it, and what Global Citizen does today or has been doing?
Yeah, sure. No worries. So Global Citizen today we describe ourselves as the world's largest action taking platform when it comes to issues of extreme poverty. Today, we have over 12 million citizens around the world taking action. We always say action is our currency. And these citizen advocates have generated more than 33 million actions. That's emails, tweets, social media posts, but all directed on specifically driving certain elements of policy change. And the impact is that, together with our partners, has unlocked more than $40 billion that's been distributed to incredible organizations on the front lines, whether it's access to sanitation, access to education, access to healthcare, access to other basic essentials in life, and in some way has touched and improved the lives of more than 1 billion people. And we often say core to our DNA is this approach that can be summed up as pop meets policy, right? Yeah. So how do you leverage the power of popular culture to drive policy change?
Yeah.
And over the years, I mean, we started establishing this, more than a decade and a half ago, but I would get emails, Instagram messages from high school students, university students, members of Rotary clubs, and they would all be interested in how they could create their own campaigns to drive change. And part of the reason why I wrote the book was not only because in this day and age, I think people are crying out for solutions and a clear roadmap and playbook to make a difference for all the reasons you and I have talked about. We live in an age of despair and apathy, despite having more means than ever before to actually create change. But secondly, the reason why I set this out is because I didn't want people to have an unhelpful yardstick. And what I mean by that is I didn't want people to think, okay, it's all well and good. You've established Global Citizen. That's this huge organization. I have to go out and do the same thing to create change. And the reason why I say that is I wanted people to be able to relate to what we did in a way that was digestible, in a way that you could unpack the principles and that could be applied by literally anyone. Whereas if you say, okay, you've got to establish this organization to create change, that itself can be disempowering. And we've all got to start from somewhere, right? Like Global Citizen, we started when we didn't have access to power networks, to capital, to influencers and others. And so, it reminded me when I would get these questions, oh, how can I do that? It reminded me of this story I sometimes tell of being a high school student. You mentioned I grew up in Australia. In Australia, we love sports, right? Sports is what we idolize. We put sports on a pedestal, which is great if you're good at sports. If you're like me, who was not great at sports, it's incredibly hard. And I have this one memory of going out we have Australian football rules, right? And I remember going out on the football pitch with this football, right, in my hand. And I remember standing there and all the other kids would be thinking, please, I just want to kick this ball and have it and score a goal. And I would be sat there saying, I just want to kick this ball and have it go in the right direction.
Take it away from my responsibility.
Yeah. I don't even care if I score a goal. I just want it to go in the right direction.
Very low goals.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
But so I'd be sat there, but of course I would be stressed, overthinking it, would kick this ball and inevitably the ball would fly off behind me. All the other kids would laugh. And then I would go in the high school assembly and, the speakers they always grabbed was either an Olympic gold medalist or some other sporting hero, right? And they'd be talking about all these amazing achievements and their roadmap to success. But I would be sat there thinking, well, that's great. You've achieved all these things, but I can't relate to that in any way.
Exactly.
And so with that in mind, I wanted to give people a digestible roadmap, no matter where they were, whether you're a cultural icon like Taylor Swift, a business leader, or an everyday citizen. It's my belief that not only can we all do something to drive the big policy changes needed for a more prosperous, healthy planet, but actually we need everyone involved and we need to be at the table. And so with that in mind, the book really doesn't profess to have all the answers, but it does look at, like, I asked myself, what do I know now that I wish I knew when we was getting started? And with that, it outlines 8 steps of policy entrepreneurship that aims to give people a start. In the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, who co-wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the way to begin is to begin. And it's my belief, if you can get people on this journey, starting to take action, that itself, right, will trigger momentum And it
Yeah.
will also inspire other friends and family. And change starts with all of us. We just need a place to begin.
Yeah, everything you said, there is no way to argue about any of that. You know, it is hard to know where to begin, but and I appreciate what you said about Eleanor Roosevelt. The way to begin is just to begin. But having, considering that, I've had nonprofits, I've run nonprofits, I've seen a lot of other people, very well intentioned, who have really put their all into it, and they did start and they tried very hard. But there is something to understanding what to do,
Yeah.
and that's why I think this book's so important, because it really, you're right, whether you're a very small potatoes, just going to school board, or you're going to whatever you're doing, trying to put a sign in the road to keep cars from slowing down, which I like, and whatever it is, this book is really helpful, and especially when it comes to dealing with people, or knowing how much to ask for, or what to accept, or how to get along with those people that are just real jerks on the school board, that you don't ever, like, you would disagree with them on everything in the world, but maybe you could agree about this one thing. I mean, that's why this book is so relevant. You are very, what you didn't mention, maybe you didn't, I missed it, but I think I think it's like $43 billion that you've mobilized to help causes around the world. I mean, and you've only been in it 12 years, so you've really figured out the magic. And that's why, yes, it's great to start, but it's also great to have some of these very specific things that you call for in the book, like goals. I mean, like, not just setting a goal, everybody knows you set a goal, but the way that you take us through the steps is really, it's really very helpful. So yeah, I love that story, because it does make it relatable for all of us, especially those of us who, I was picturing myself being the softball pitcher, and I kept, like, I had this really good pitch once in a while, but then I'd, like, roll it along the ground, and they're always saying, "Hey, we're not bowling," So I relate to many of those very embarrassing moments in sports. All right, so maybe let's talk about a little bit more. It's hard to categorize, or to go into all the depth of what you've done. And when you talk about I think you've impacted more than, like, something like 1.4 billion people in the world. That's like an eighth of the world, right? About, which is like impacting every person in India or every person in China. I was thinking, like, if we could clone you 7 times, we'd have all the world's.
And I think there's a reason why, and I talk about this in the book, right? People say, well, who is a policy entrepreneur? And I talk about, the fact that a policy entrepreneur, and it can be a group, but, those who, yes, you can be a visionary, right? And you need to be a diplomat, right? And I mean diplomat in the sense of building consensus.
Mm-hmm.
How do you build win-win? And sometimes you have to do that through gritted teeth, right?
Yeah.
Build coalitions. And then finally, it's the role of the implementer. And that doesn't sound sexy or glamorous at all.
That's where the rubber meets the road, though.
Rubber hits the road. Yeah, that's where you land the plane.
Yeah.
Literally. And I think too often, there are many promises that gets made. There are big figures thrown around. And then everyone walks away and no one pays attention to the detail. Everyone gets a clap on their back. They walk out. And there's almost no incentive to follow through. And I think if you look at what Global Citizen did, there had been benefit concerts before, right? You look at Live Aid, you look at the concert for Bangladesh, often these big promises that get made. I think what Global Citizen said is, yes, okay, we're going to drive towards these big flashpoints. And we're still doing this here in Central Park. We just announced this week our Global Citizen Festival, which for any of your listeners in New York, it'll be taking place in Central Park, September 28th. We've got a great lineup, and you can earn a ticket by taking action at globalcitizen.org. But it was also the sense that once the festival is over, the stage gets taken down. It's a 365-day-a-year movement.
Yeah.
And citizen-led accountability is key to delivery. It's key to making sure promises made are promises delivered, and you need a way to engage people throughout the year. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is we need more implementers, and I used a quote in the start of the book from Steve Jobs, right, where he talks about it's great to have an idea, but where's the follow through? Where's the hard work? Because good ideas can come from anywhere, right? But it's and there is a skill, and I talk about this in the vision, being able to identify actionable solutions and being able to know, okay, which solutions to push for. Like there's definitely an art in that, but also how do you transform that into impact? And a big part of that is accountability, and how do you build ways to hold people accountable. And that's really been, you asked what's been the ingredient of Global Citizen, and for an organization known for these big events and big flashpoint moments, but it's really just a tip of the iceberg. Every commitment, and we track more than $60 billion worth of commitment, is stored on Salesforce. We track everyone religiously, and I think with new technologies like AI, we can automate this so we can do this even better in real time. But as you said, that's where the rubber hits the road, and that's where lives are really changed. And ultimately, it's only then, because people can come along, they can have a good time, you can release the dopamine. But ultimately, sustained happiness, right, is when you've seen that actually, no, I've actually made an impact. Looking back, something has actually changed. I haven't just shouted something into the ether or called for something.
I wonder how much of the, you have to have certain skills to be an implementer. You have to have certain skills to be a diplomat, to be a visionary. These are all, they're not usually all found in one person. It's nice. I don't know how it's, kind of works with all of you at your organization. But what I notice about you, and I think why this is so successful, is that you're very humble. And as I said, I've had an organization. I had an organization where I took kids to the Middle East and worked with kids there and all that. And there's so much. Before you even do anything, you get all these pats on the back, and you haven't really even done anything except have the idea and start to implement it. And it's very tempting. It's this very kind of like sexy thing to I'm changing the world and everybody thinks you're great and all that. And then to kind of just get lost in that with the dopamine and forget that this is hard work every day of the year. And I don't know how you've, I don't know if you address that in the book, but I don't know how you've carried on through 12 years. I mean, again, you're humble because you haven't mentioned, you work with the president of the World Bank, you work with prime ministers, you work with huge stars, Beyonce, and I'll let you say because I'm not very good at holding them all in my head, but just the stars that you have every, Billie Eilish and John Legend and all these people, Coldplay frontman with Chris Martin, right? Yeah. In fact, I think he's leading up your thing at the
he's along with Jane Goodall, both speaking at this year's festival. So she's an incredible
I might
human
have to
being.
sneak out there. No, she's incredible, and she's one who never went with her ego, never got ahead of her, and she's still every single day. I think I don't know if she's still traveling 300 days a year.
She still is. Yeah, she still is. Yeah.
I can't remember her age now either.
She was just in Australia in Perth with my sister actually. 2 weeks ago, and she's speaking. Yeah, she's still traveling 300 days of a year, and she still has a phenomenal amount of hope, positive hope. In her words, there's still a lot worth fighting for. Yeah. And there is still the opportunity for us to make a difference. We can make a difference because we have made a difference, and we shouldn't be counting ourselves out or betting against what humanity can achieve when we let our better angels inspire us.
Well, and I think you said also earlier that, first of all, what you just said, we know we can make change because we have made change. Like that's hugely important. But also, just never losing. I think Jane Goodall has this expression that, what did she say? Something about hope. Without hope, there really is no hope. I mean, it sounds funny, but it's absolutely the truth. And
hope grounded in reality, though,
right?
Because I think
action.
It has to be authentic. Because otherwise, if you're talking about hope and you're not acknowledging where people's feelings of despair are coming from, right? Yeah. Then you can sound almost like a little bit wacky.
Yeah.
If you got your head in the sand. But I think, you can talk about it in the context of climate change, right? I'm sat here talking to you, we got this huge heat dome here in New York City. And some of the stories coming out of India where young babies dying because of extreme heat. I read the story the other day about a baby 2 days old dying because of the extreme heat. And so you were literally seeing this calamity unfold. But at the same time, the flip side of that is actually this year, global emissions might peak for the first time. And we still have this opportunity to turn the curve.
Yeah.
And so there I can see the reality driving the urgency, but I can also see the path forward where we can still make a difference. And often one only talks about one side of the coin. And I think our hope is genuine, but if it's genuine, if we can show people concretely a clear roadmap to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And I think that's what leadership is. That's what policy entrepreneurs are about. And I don't know if you've read the book Ministry of the Future or heard of that.
I haven't, but I heard you talking about it on a podcast, and actually I wrote it down to get it because it sounded amazing.
So it's a great it's a fantastic science fiction book. And the other day, just because of what's going on in the world right now, in Ministry of the Future probably came out maybe 2021, right? And it's one of those books that people are looking at now, and they're saying, okay, is this a case of fiction becoming reality, right? And part of the reason why they're saying that is because at the start of Ministry of the Future, there's this opening scene which takes place in India in a not too far distant future, where you have this huge heat wave. And literally, I think thousands of people, hundreds of people go into the water in this Indian community, and they literally poached alive in this water, right?
Well, it's possible, yeah.
And at the same time, you start seeing people, how do they respond to this? And there's this group, which I guess you could call them eco-terrorists. They start disrupting people's lives, and it gets more aggressive as time goes on, right? They go from social disruption, protests, to eventually more targeting of lives, etc., like destruction. And then on the other hand, you have, and that group is called the Children of Cali. On the other hand, you then have this group called the Ministry of the Future, which is really like this elite group of policy entrepreneurs. And they're the ones saying, well, what solutions can we come up with? And the reason why I like this book is there are moments where you think it's going to get dark and depressing, and then somehow there's a shift and it ends up, with a positive ending. And it's rooted in this concept of, I think, coming back to your point about hope. The call for hope can sound inauthentic if we're promising people a utopia, right? If you're promising people it's all going to be great. And the problem with that, you're just setting people up for more disillusionment. And really what Ministry of the Future comes up with is we shouldn't be going for utopia. We should be searching for optopia. What is the most optimum outcome we can achieve with the tools and the resources in front of us? And when you paint it in front of that, when you paint it in those terms, there's a lot we can achieve, right? We can achieve optopia. And the reason why I say this, and I was reflecting on this, is a few days ago, you saw Stonehenge. There was that protest in the UK, right? And there was the orange paint, I think, that was thrown on. So I did a poll on LinkedIn, and I said, do people think these campaign methods are effective and necessary, counterproductive?
Kind of shock campaigns, right? Like,
because
they covered I don't know if people know about, they covered, it was for climate change, right? They're making a point about climate change, and they
just
took
stop
Stonehenge right around the time of the equinox, the
summer solstice.
Summer solstice, sorry. And they threw paint all over the, beautiful rocks. And I don't know if they were able to get it off, but anyway, go ahead.
No, you're
Yeah.
exactly right. And
Yeah.
so there was all these debates around, and you've seen this in the past, people disrupting traffic, people disrupting, people throwing paintings, I think, at the Mona Lisa, all protected, right? And I think sometimes the media blow this up and make it worse than it actually is. But I put this poll, and someone posted on my LinkedIn. They said, the children of Cali will rise unless the Ministry of the Future takes real responsibility. And I basically put that on back to what I call for in the book, is that when people are apathetic, right, and their powerlessness, they will look for other ways to make a difference. And often those other ways can be unhelpful, counterproductive, distractions, whether it's calling out others on social media, regardless of what you think, without actually changing people's lives. And I think one thing that you can predict is, in the absence of solutions, and I do believe if you can anchor advocacy and campaigning in real actionable solutions, especially now when people are crying out for solutions, it will act as a magnet in the fog, and people will gravitate around you. But in the absence of that, when you even have leaders like the UN Secretary General saying I'm powerlessness, then you can expect more social upheaval to come as people are crying out. And that's where the division comes in. But that's also the opportunity for leadership, whether you're in a nonprofit organization at the community level, to really buck that counter narrative and say, well, actually, here's a solution. And you asked me before, Deborah, about, well, what are some ingredients to really do that, right? What's the most critical in the book? And I won't go through all 8 principles, but I think, if I can just list 4 very quickly.
I'd love you to. Yeah, sure.
I think because we've spoken about the implementer, so we'll leave the rubber hits the road. I think one thing is, identifying those really actionable solutions. Because one thing I notice when people were coming to me asking for help, often they would have no shortage of problems and they would have diagnosed the problems, but often all they wanted to do was run campaigns, raise an awareness about the problem. And at Global Citizen, for instance, we banned the phrase awareness raising. It's like, where can we add value? Because otherwise you're just sending people down this path where they're eventually going to be even more disillusioned.
We're pretty aware of most of the issues right now.
and the research bears that out, right?
Yeah.
But the good news is there's lots of solutions in the book. Identify how. The second one is stories of why. And you asked me before why I was humble, right? And that's very kind, and that's your judgment, not mine. But like, you're asking me, okay, where does that come from? And the reason why stories of why are important is that's how you begin to build trust, regardless of when you make it about an outcome alone, it can be very hard. And one thing that I've always said, and it relates to what you were saying about early on when people are like, oh, great, you've done all these great things and believe in the hype. I've always remembered what it was like at the start of high school to be that kid who couldn't kick a ball, whose self-esteem was so low that I also had bad grades. I was bottom of the class. Yeah. And I remembered the difference one teacher made in my life, who said, you may not see it in you, but I see potential. I'm willing to work with you. And I remember the difference that made in me. So when people started saying, oh, wow, you did all these wonderful things, I was like, oh, no, I still remember what it was like to be that kid who people said was a loser, wasn't going to amount to much, wasn't going to achieve much, and the difference that teacher made in my life. So often I tell that story as why, because we all need, not necessarily a teacher in the classroom, but those people around us. And sometimes that could even be in terms of the basics, like access to healthcare, access to a midwife if you're giving birth in a country where 1 in 8 children still die below the age of 5, or including in childbirth. And then I would say another ingredient, so you've got identifying clear actionable goals. You've got the stories of why, right, to begin to build that trust. And then I would say a third one, and this brings it back to the story in Stonehenge, is not to let the purity test get in the way of doing good, right?
Yeah, say more about that.
Yeah, well, it's not subjecting every activity we do to this artificial, superficial purity test and saying, okay, if it doesn't ladder up here, we're not going to engage. I think
Oh,
I use a message from the Pope during the book where he convened
yeah,
during the pandemic all of these leaders of different faiths.
yeah,
And I think some people in the Catholic Church said, "What are you doing? This
yeah.
is engaging with the infidel." And he turned around and he said, "If you don't think we're all praying to the same God, then you've clearly missed the point, right?"
It's just,
And
yeah, it's
and
perfect.
and the reason why I say that, and that comes back to the example we used in Stonehenge, right, is I'm not against, and I won't go into the merits of this. I think time will tell if these campaign tactics have been effective or not. But I do see in the past, one way of making change has been to advocate for extreme positions, right? In America, there's a great environmental campaigner called Bill McKibben,
Oh,
and
yeah.
the impact of his campaign is often called the McKibben effect, where essentially by campaigning for divestment from fossil fuel companies on campus, he was often able to change the conversation from should we take action on climate change to the question of how do we take action, and open up the door for more consensus approaches on
Mm-hmm.
perhaps other solutions like clean energy subsidies, right? But sometimes when you campaign for extreme positions, right, rather than making perhaps less radical measures seem more moderate and appealing by comparison, sometimes there's a tendency to look behind you and look everyone else who's claiming to be, say, for the environment and say, well,
Mm-hmm.
hey, if you're not out here with me, right, are you really a campaigner? And basically to resort in infighting, right? And when that
Oh,
happens, that turns people away. That is corrosive. And that's why coming back to Jane Goodall, something she said in response to some of these actions, she's saying, I get people are angry,
yeah.
but is it the best way to disrupt ordinary people's lives? Or should we be disrupting the lives of those in power, those with the ability to make a difference, right? And so these are questions here to grapple with, and I call this pragmatic idealism in the book. I'm not asking for incrementalism, but I'm asking for idealism to always be grounded in a pragmatic considerations of how you persuade and influence people.
You
And
know,
then, yeah, go on.
I want you to go ahead, finish your point if you.
Well, I was just going to say the fourth ingredient, right, is really coalition building. No one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And perhaps this is the most significant principle, is the question of, okay, what is my strengths? What am I good at? What are my shortfalls? And then finding other organizations and leveraging those platforms. Yeah. And I've got a bunch of stories in the book of where I've seen this done well, but that is probably the number one ingredient. Without partnership, without complementary coalition building, we're never going to achieve all of these work. And we're so stronger together, right? Than in our own bubbles, trying to each do our own thing and trying to do everything all at once.
What I was going to interrupt you with is I'm kind of glad you finished that fourth point, because I think the reason that, maybe it's obvious that the reason why people do things that are disrupting the lives of ordinary people rather than going to people in power is because that's what they know to do. You're angry and you're like, what can we do? Well, everyone would think, not everyone, many people would think that they don't have access to presidents and prime ministers and anyone of influence. And I always feel like one of the biggest struggles is that I really do think most people want to help. I truly do. I hear it every day of my life, but most of I see people not doing anything. And so that disconnect, what is that? That's where we're missing so much buy-in and use of all this value that would come from so many more people. We're going to talk about your app in a minute, but I think you have to give people a way that don't know, because how many people are studying climate change? They're working all day long. They have kids, they have bills. We all know the drill. Nobody has time to go out and research, what can I do for climate change? And maybe I should buy an electric car is really as far as it gets. And that's problematic. So It's
Well,
anger,
and
frustration.
we forget, those of us in this, according to research, only 8% of US households will even talk about climate change at any one time in a year.
Yeah,
Right?
I heard you say that, and that is very, very, it's shocking, because all you hear about on the news is the heat dome, the floods, the fires. How is it only 8% people? Because if you were to ask people if they thought that fossil fuels or something like that caused climate change, I would think most people would agree, worldwide, globally at least. So how is it that only 8% of them are talking about it? Because they have no agency. They are lacking knowledge
I've
and
spoken
agency.
and I've written about this before. Like, I think the language of policy change, like when people think of how they can make a difference, you can volunteer your time, plant some trees, you can volunteer, you can register to vote if you're in the US, you can donate to a charity. But on a question like climate change, when we're seeing, okay, is it really about our personal behavior? Like during the pandemic, when global emissions fell by just a few percent,
Yeah, I
even
was
when we
shocked at
all
that.
even
Yeah,
when we was all locked into our house, right?
yeah,
People
yeah,
said, well, okay, if it's not really about my personal behavior, me
yeah.
riding to work instead of driving, right? And if that's such a,
Right.
like, what can I do? Because policy change, right? Systems change, it seems so aloof. It seems so impenetrable, right? The
Mm-hmm.
language isn't exactly accessible. It's not the first thing anyone thinks of when it says, okay, how can I change the world as an
No, it's not.
individual? It doesn't come to
Yeah.
mind. And I think that the challenge for those of us working in this space is, how do we break this down? And this has been really what we've tried to do at Global Citizen, is give people an accessible way that you can contribute to systems change, policy change, right? Without needing to study this or work as a professional lobbyist. And I think, the language matters, because what is policy change at the end of the day? It's about changing people's lives. It's about human beings, both in terms of who it impacts, but also the people who shape policy. It's a very human endeavor. It's about all of us, and it's often a choice, and it happens at the community level as well. And so I think, the good news is I've seen so many of these stories, and I've literally seen advocates with no access of power. And often, one of the things I say is, if you know your goal, right, just having that clarity of goal. In the book, I talk about naively, boldly audacious goals. And I talk about, even if you don't have any implementation experience, even if you don't have access to power, access to funding, if you have a very clear goal and start sharing that with people, you might be surprised by those who you thought would help you and don't. And there will be some surprises. Some people will let you down. But I guarantee you, the biggest thing that will surprise you is the amount of people willing to support and the amount of people who you would be connected to. Because we all have to start somewhere. And that was my experience when we were starting the first Global Citizen campaign. And that's often been my experience. Think, speaking with advocates, often they've maybe committed something in an email, they've reached out, and they've often said things to me like, we didn't think anyone would reply, but we thought we would give it a go anyway. That's often the start of the story.
The boldness and audacity. It's I think this is a good time to talk about, I don't know if you can see, I don't know if people can see this, and it's just one screen, but this is the app for Global Citizen. It's one of the pages of the app. What I really like about this is that it lets people, I mean, we talk, like we say mobilize. You haven't really raised $43 billion. You've gotten $43 billion to move in the direction of people who are in need. And also, I just want to clarify, because we've been talking, like, it looks like when you go on your website and when people talk about that, you were talking about poverty, ending severe, I don't know what the terminology, I can't remember.
Extreme poverty.
Poverty. But really, you work on climate change, you work on a lot of different issues, so that they all kind of feed into, there's definitely ties. So
exactly. So our true north is, and I do think it's good to have your goal, right? And anchor. So our goal as an organization is the end of extreme poverty. And, that could be lack of access to water. I think where climate change comes in, we're not an environmental advocacy group. There's many groups working on that. But I think the fact that it's often poor, vulnerable communities who are on the receiving end of climate change, who are seeing the impacts. And that could be in inner urban cities in America, right, where tree coverage is less. And actually, on a day like today, in a cement urban jungle, having more trees is one of the best things you can do. Or it could be a small island nation seeing an increased amount of hurricanes, rise in sea levels. And so and at the same time, many of these communities often themselves don't have access to electricity, right? And so when you're talking about weaving them off fossil fuels, they're like, hold on, we don't even have electricity, and fossil fuels is the cheapest source. And if you're taking that away, does that mean we decline to live in poverty? And so for us, it's fundamentally about equity. And when we talk about climate change and poverty, it's like, okay, well, how do we make sure we prevent the impacts of climate change, but also how can we give people a pathway? The fact 600 million people in Africa don't have access to reliable electricity. How can we give people a pathway? Because it cannot be the case that action on climate change means that people living in poverty have to stay poor, and we need to solve that issue. Otherwise, we're solving one problem, but creating another problem here.
Yeah. Well, all right. So I want to just go back to this for a moment. I'm just looking at different campaigns. There's so many things to do, but what this allows people to do is participate in things without donating money. I'm just looking at these all different campaigns, but you give people points for, you could, and it shows in the book how sometimes when I see, sign up for send a tweet, or people asking me to send an email or a tweet or write a letter, I was thinking, is it really that significant? And some of the examples that you give in the book, it's hugely significant when the numbers get big. So you can download this app. I'm just looking, it's like President Macron, don't betray our global future. I'm not even going to go into what they all mean. Africa Just Transition. Your voices power our planet. I don't know. There's just so many different campaigns that you work in. Fossil Free Future. Free up the funds. You kind of have to go into each one to see what they're about. But there's so many campaigns on here, and there's you can find what speaks to you. And I just think this gives, do you remember that, or did you read that book, Made to Stick?
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what this reminds me of. And it's just that when you give people, when they start thinking of themselves, I'll just take 30 seconds to tell what they did in that book, is that they asked people if they could put these very simple signs on their front lawn. I don't even know what they were, like something about grass or vote, very non-threatening signs, very small, innocuous. And some people agreed to do it. And then when they came back later, they asked them if they could put up these bigger signs that were a little bit more offensive and more engaging people to, a little bit more edgy. And the people who had already put the little signs on that were not edgy at all were much more likely to put those big signs up, because they now thought of themselves as activists or people who cared about an action or a cause or something. It's how and I think we're kind of stuck there in many ways, that we look at that there's activists, quote, there's people like you that are, doing huge things and making massive changes. But I'm not really that person. I'm not a troublemaker kind of thing, and I don't have power. And this gives people power. And when they start thinking of themselves, and then they get points, and then with those points they can do more, and they can even, I'm not sure what all you can do with the points. You might have to tell me that, but it's very engaging. So it's Global Citizen, and it's a, free app, of course. And just, if nothing else, I would encourage people to just go on here and just see what speaks to them.
Well, and one thing I would say is, even each of those campaigns is a story of individuals behind them. And what we were talking before about people saying, where can I start? This can seem very hard to know where to engage, right? About 5-6 years ago, we started working in South Africa, and we were asked by the government of South Africa to do this big campaign and event to honor the legacy of what would have been the 100th birthday of Nelson Mandela. And we launched this campaign. We had Beyonce, Jay-Z, Oprah Winfrey, all of these big people involved. And of course, three hashtags when we announced this that was trending across the country. One was Mandela 100. The second was Beyonce. And the third was this hashtag called It's Bloody Time. And we said, okay, well, where's that coming from? And it turned out it was a campaign being driven by these remarkable young women who were basically talking about the fact that period poverty, when period products are so inaffordable that girls have to drop out of school when they have their periods. And in some cases in South Africa, I learned that some girls lose up to 60 days of school a year just because they lack something as basic as a tampon or sanitary pad or napkin.
Which really affects their education. My gosh.
Exactly. And these young women were saying, well, look, it's very simple, right? Some of these products are being taxed as luxury goods. Why are they being taxed? Let's remove that tax. And secondly, why aren't these products being available for free in schools, particularly in poorer communities and neighborhoods? And they asked us, would we take up these two goals? And honestly, that we made that front and center of that campaign. And I talk about this in the book. I dedicate a chapter to it, the origin of this, but we put it front and center. It became one of the most popular campaigns we've ever run. Galvanized millions of people. People jumped in around it. I remember them walking in with the minister, slamming a petition down on the table that shook the table. And ultimately, the government did make this commitment. And then coming to the implementer, they made sure relevant budgets, it went through the parliament, the money was there, even through the pandemic, which threatened to derail progress. And I think something like, since that promise was made, as a result of their collective efforts, something like 4 million girls have now received access to period products that didn't have it before. And there's, of course, still an unmet need. But the reason why I tell that story is these young women they didn't seek to build their own platform. They knew what they wanted to achieve. And then they came out. They asked us to leverage a platform. Yeah. And there's many examples like that of where change begins. And then you've got people, global citizen, learning about these issues in Colorado and taking action. So I think for me, it's like, that's the first step. And then you see the response of that and you're like, aha, it does work. And that's where we need to go as a society, I believe, to show people that we can create powerful examples of impact to trigger other stories of impact.
Such a great story, because that is not a topic that's easy to get front and center. I mean, the fact that you took that on and that they were able to parlay your power into something that really made change. And there's so many lessons in all these stories that you tell in the book. There are so many, angles to it that you can learn from. But I love that one because I know how long and hard that journey has been for, getting access to period products in Africa and around the world. It's certainly not just limited to Africa, and how much that affects education. So it's a beautiful story. There's a story in here too about that there's this one about the coal, transitioning coal, to a greener technology, which is so it's really heart-wrenching and heartwarming because of the way it has, it's a success story really in transitioning to a cleaner environment. And there's so few and far between. So it's gosh, I'll tell you, this book is worth it just to read that one story.
Well, and I think just there, I have an update because people loved that story. And when I was back in Australia recently, we went to that community. It's in the southwest of Australia, and it's this community of Collie. And it's a century-old coal mining community. It's DNA. They say if you walk in, you go to a barbecue, the first thing people might say is "G'day, hey." The second thing is a conversation about coal unwraps, right? But now it's got this great story. People say there's more people in the community. They've invested in tourism, alternative jobs. We were there when new projects were just breaking ground. This was all in March. A lot of people have asked for an update, and just literally this week on my Substack, I literally just published an update that tells this story with some photos about where this is progressing and where the changes unfold in that town. But people who've read the book or want to find out more, they can head to my Substack to to get the latest.
Your Substack is fantastic, and I would very much encourage people to sign up, because it's like reading the book, but then it becomes like live. Things are happening at that moment, and I don't even know how you keep up with your life. I just, because I'm looking at that thing and it's so long and so many stories, and I just was reading your Substack yesterday, and I was like, it's so alive and happy, and I loved reading it. I mean, I think if people just I think you can just go to substack.com and type in your name, but there's probably a better way.
Yeah, that's right. You can find it. Probably the best way is if you head to my website, which is michaelsheldrick.com. You can find it. You can find it there. You can learn about the book, which is also available also on Audible as well. It's not.
Did you read it?
But,
it's not?
I didn't narrate it. No, they found it. They found another fellow Australian in New York. No, the way they do these things, I found out, is unless you're super famous with a very distinct voice like Prince Harry, I guess.
Yeah.
They kind of bash these things out. But they did find, honestly, a great narrator, fellow Australian who lives in New York. He does a fantastic job, and it's just over 6 hours, which I think for Audible books, it's very short.
On the short side, yeah.
Yeah, it's very crisp. So you can check that out. And my Substack, if you want to go directly there, it's michaelsheldrick.substack.com as well.
Yeah. I'll definitely, as I always do, have all these links on the show notes on the website, on my website and YouTube, everywhere wherever people are watching this, you have access to the show notes and all those links. But I would really, I'd encourage people to do all of these things. I'm trying to see. There was a story that I really wanted to get to, and I don't know if you have time, but what happened in Barbados was, maybe we can just touch on it for briefly if you can, because there's a woman who is we'll call her a policy. She's a prime minister, Mia Mobley, right?
Mia Motley, yeah.
Motley. I knew I had something wrong. Mia Motley. Yeah, I mean, she's another incredible example of a policy entrepreneur, and it really puts to use every single thing, or you took from her, I don't know, kind of a mixture of how you've taken all your points and this one woman. I mean, there's just so much I got from this in terms of climate justice, and in terms of she's a Black woman from Barbados who's a prime minister, and Barbados, as you said, is always kind of punched above their weight. They've always been really good at doing a number of things, but she's in a class of her own. And I think for the example of, I don't know if I want to use that old speaking truth to power, but I mean, she is the power now. And she takes the truth of what's happening to her country as an island nation. I think in this country, in the US and in other wealthy Western nations, we think about climate change. We neglect to think about what's happening to all these islands. I just finished writing a book about Tuvalu and a novel about what's happening there, and which is another island nation. The things that are happening around the world that we're not privy to in terms of climate change we're privy to. We're not seeking out the information, but there's so much here with this woman who really took all these points of not getting everything you want, and dealing with people that you may not want to work with, and getting what you can, and standing up to enemies, and building coalitions. And I think if you're a person of color, if you're a woman, if you're from a small country, if you feel like you don't have the power that these giant countries have, read this story of this woman and what she's accomplished for Barbados, for other, island nations, and what she's done for climate justice. It's been a perfect example of literally everything that you talk about in this book. There's so many good stories in here. Yeah.
No, so Prime Minister Mia Motley, and I think it's worth bearing in perspective. Barbados, the equivalent economic clout, if you were to measure this in US cities, you'd have to go 360 cities down to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. to find a city with the same economic size of Barbados
It's a
economy,
small
right?
country, especially
Yeah.
compared to our countries. Yeah.
And yet she probably drove one of the biggest policy breakthroughs globally, notwithstanding gridlock, that will have a material impact on her country.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, one thing you find in the Caribbean is small island nations not only see hurricanes, natural disasters, right, at an increased rate because of climate change, but these nations are also the most indebted nations in the world, because you're hit by a hurricane, your entire economy is wiped out. So you have to take out loans to recover. And then as you're paying off those loans, you're hit by another one. You get into this horrible disaster.
Yeah,
and then you never have the resources because you're paying a huge chunk of your revenue off in loans, right? You never have the resources to build back better and actually prevent these disasters in the future. And so she came up with this innovative tactic that she took from another country, the Guyana, which basically says, listen, if there is a disaster, I should have a reprieve. I should have a suspension of my debt, right, which is recognized. Give me 2 years. Let me reinvest the money instead of repaying off those debts into recovery, response, building back better. And not only will I then repay off my loans, this actually guarantees I'm more likely to pay off my loans, but I will be in a much better situation, right? And this won't cost you anything more. And people laughed her out of Wall Street, all of this. And yet she managed to convince some of the biggest institutions in the world, like the World Bank, to respond and make this commitment. And, I think this will unlock the equivalent of $700 million, which is like the equivalent of 15% of their economy if there's a future hurricane. And we just got the news the other day that later this month, the head of the World Bank will be visiting Barbados to officially sign this into
beautiful.
law. But it's a great example of how to make an idea into impact. It's a great idea of how to be pragmatic, how to build coalitions, how to reach across.
Right.
It's got all of the ingredients we've been working with. And it also shows you, how change is made, but also how to leverage the platforms of others in order to do this. It's a remarkable story, and I've learned a lot from her. She's an incredible leader.
Can you tell me just briefly how Global Citizen or how you specifically get involved in a situation like that? Because that's one thing I feel like we didn't get to touch on in this podcast, and I know we're out of time, but I feel like we might be missing that one ingredient of what do you actually do when how do you work with someone in that situation?
So I met the Prime Minister 2.5 years ago, and she was asking for help because she had been laughed out of Washington, Wall Street. And so she was saying, listen, I might be able to convince, a president to host a summit, right, with all the financing chiefs, but then how do we get this front and center? How do we get them to care? And she managed to convince the president of France to host this big summit literally a year ago tomorrow. It was June 22nd last year, and it was taking place. And she said, would Global Citizen organize a big event, right, in front of the Eiffel Tower as all of these people come, right, to really put this issue front and center? And we managed to get the likes of Lenny Kravitz. I remember when the Prime Minister, she was on the phone with Billie Eilish's mum saying, if Billie wants to be a champion for climate justice, she's got to care about these small island nations. We convened all these artists. And then in the days leading up to this summit, we galvanized citizens around the world. They sent 250,000 actions to Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, which is the biggest shareholder of the World Bank. We sent it to the head of the World Bank. And then we also had the likes of Rihanna, Billie Eilish, add their voices online. And lo and behold, up on our stage with the Prime Minister, the President of the World Bank made this commitment, and now is following through on that and implementing it and saying across all of their loan agreements with a country like Barbados, if there is a disaster, if there is a hurricane, we will automatically pause debt repayments from these countries. So yeah, I guess in that, again, no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. Because the Prime Minister was like, she was like, yes, I'm a leader of a sovereign nation, but when I go to DC, when I go to these meetings, I'm often treated like a protester. I have to go on the outside to make my voice heard. And so she's like, if that's the case, I'm gonna convene a powerful coalition of allies. And it's a great example of coalition building.
Wow, it's really a great example too of what Global Citizen does. And what I also want to say is like the what do you call it? The app. Well, that was probably one of the actions you could take on the app, right? Was to show solidarity for that.
Exactly.
Just a
Solidarity,
text.
but you notice it's always with a very targeted ask, and we have
Sure.
it
Oh
like,
yeah.
yeah, no awareness raising, no platitudes here. Because I do genuinely think, and the research has borne this out, right? If you want people to just engage with your content, talk about how bad the world is, right?
It'll go
That's going to get a
forever.
lot of engagement.
Yeah.
But in doing so, you're probably, and again, the research bears this out, you're going to over time erode people's belief that their actions can make a difference.
Right.
Whereas even
Right.
if it's something simple, ask people to write a letter to a future child, that will be grappling with the consequences of climate change 20 years from now.
Yeah.
Write down the actions you can still take, research. People are more likely to walk away saying, aha, there's something that I can do about this.
Just gave me an idea. Well, I love that because it shows that people can just like go on here and get an idea and get a specific campaign that means something to them and act really easily and quickly and kind of empower themselves. All right. I hated to throw that last thing in there because I know we're over time, but it just feels really important to understand fully what you do and how people's, actions can impact outcomes. So thank you so much. I know your time is quite valuable and very valuable. And I appreciate so much everything that you've done for the world, for all of us, and that you are doing, and for letting us learn how to do it ourselves. So
no,
appreciate it much.
Thank you, Deborah. There's a lot here, and I think
there's a lot.
I end with this interview in the epilogue with this 105-year-old World War II veteran who was talking about being in the depths of the war in Europe and how he maintained hope. And just something to leave with your listeners, he said, we realized we haven't got much, but we're not running away. We give it a go. And I think that's the challenge. We've got a lot more than his generation had, right? And
so
can't
much.
run away. But are we willing to give it a go? And I think again, to quote Jane Goodall, there's still a lot worth fighting for and a lot we can do. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. Hopefully I get to see you in Colorado one of these days.
Thanks so much, Deborah.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.